Saturn's Golden Age. The age that man later called the Age of Kronos is remembered with nostalgia as an age of bliss. References to the Age of Kronos in ancient lore are very numerous. Hesiod tells of a golden race of mortal men who lived in the time of Kronos when he was reigning in heaven, and they lived like gods without sorrow of heart, remote and free from toil. Miserable age rested not on them. The fruitful earth unforced bare them fruit abundantly and without stint. They dwelt in ease and peace upon their lands with many good things. Similarly, writes Ovid in the 6th book of his Metamorphoses, in the beginning was the Golden Age, when men of their own accord, without threat of punishment, without laws, maintained good faith, and did what was right. The earth itself, without compulsion, untouched by the hoe, unfurrowed by any share, produced all things spontaneously. It was a season of everlasting spring. Rabbinical sources recount that men lived under very favorable conditions before the deluge, and that these contributed to their sinfulness. They knew neither toil nor care, and as a consequence of their extraordinary prosperity, they grew insolent. The dominance of Saturn at some remote period in the history of life of the peoples on Earth was of such pronounced and all-pervading character that the question arises whether the adventures of the planet going through many exploits could by itself be the full cause of the worship of the planet and the naming of the Golden Age, the Age of Kronos, Saturn. Saturn exploded and caused the Earth to go through the greatest of its historical catastrophes, and this was completely sufficient to make of Saturn the supreme deity. But it appears that the age of Saturn is a name for the epoch before the deluge. After the deluge, Saturn, dismembered, almost ceased to exist as a planetary body, and when at length it was reconstituted, it was fettered by rings, and was far from being the dominant celestial body that would behoove it as the supreme deity of the epoch. The age of Kronos is so glorious an age that it is hardly thinkable to connect it with the period after the deluge. The wailing for Adonis, Tammuz of the Babylonians, or Osiris of the Egyptians, deplored the end of its dominance, not the beginning of it. Then why was Saturn the supreme deity by whose name the great and glorious age before the deluge was named? Because it removed Uranus from its role of chief deity, and to the onlookers on Earth emasculated him. If the distances between the Earth and Saturn and Uranus were then what they are now, then such occurrences could scarcely be observable. Uranus is only faintly visible in the night sky over Mesopotamia in a most translucent night. Saturn is clearly visible, but is not, for an unaided eye, a spectacle in the sky. It was more voluminous and more luminous before the deluge, but if it moved on an orbit not too different from the present one, and Earth were moving approximately in the same quarters where it moves today, then the surprise still persists as how a body on a 30-year-long orbit could make the inhabitants of the Earth on its 1-year-long orbit regard it as the supreme of all celestial bodies in the sky. The appellative sun employed for Saturn could be explained by its unusual brightness when it exploded as a nova for a short time, actually for 7 days before the beginning of the deluge on Earth, assuming the length of the day in those times to have been not too dissimilar from its present value, the velocity of the moving masses being in the order of 100 kilometers a second, or 8,600,000 kilometers in a 24-hour period, and the Earth and Saturn being on the closest points of their reciprocal orbits, or in conjunction, which is another surmise. In 7 days, a distance of circa 60 million kilometers would be covered. On present orbits, the distance between Saturn and Earth varies from 1,279 million kilometers at superior conjunction and 1,578 million kilometers at opposition. The lesser of these distances is circa 21 times greater than that above calculated. This means also that unless the velocity of the ejected water was an order of magnitude greater than 100 kilometers per second, The distance between Saturn and Earth must have been substantially smaller than it is at present. I have rather arbitrarily selected a figure of 100 kilometers a second for the motion of the exploded material. Today, the escape velocity, or the speed required for a projectile on the surface of Saturn to leave the gravitational attraction of the planet, is but 35 kilometers a second. For Jupiter, the escape velocity is 59 kilometers a second. Assuming that Saturn was a mass equal to that of Jupiter, the same figure would apply to it too. With 100 kilometers a second, we have almost double the velocity of escape. The arbitrariness of the assumption of such velocity for our calculations is obvious, but if the set of figures is not too far from what they actually were, the conclusion would be that of Earth from Saturn was but a 20th part of what it is now. This would permit us to speculate whether Earth could, at some early period, have been a satellite of Saturn. The distance, 60 million kilometers, is commensurate with the distance of Mercury from the Sun, or 58 million kilometers. Jupiter's satellites revolve at distances up to 24 million kilometers from the primary. Theoretically, Saturn could have satellites as large as the Earth. The Moon is only 1/40th of the Earth in volume, whereas Saturn is 760 times larger than our planet. If such was ever the case, the age of Saturn, and the very unusual conditions under which mankind lived in it, and Saturn's worship prior to the deluge, would gain in meaning. The appellative sun used for Saturn would be understood as resulting not only from the great light it emitted for a short period when a nova, but also from its long-standing role of a primary for the revolving Earth. If there is truth in the surmise, and nothing more it is than a surmise, that the Earth was once a satellite of Saturn, the latter must have revolved closer to the Sun in order that the Earth should receive heat from it. Saturn exudes little heat, and if the age of Kronos was a golden age, then it is also proper to assume that the conditions on the satellite Earth were not unfavorable for life. The geological record documents extreme climates for the past of the Earth. Times when corals grew in the Arctic, and times when the Earth, partly even on the equator, was fettered by ice. Such climates require definitely abnormal conditions that could be created only by varying positions of our planet as an astronomical body. Therefore, surmises as made in this section are not in conflict with geological and paleoclimatological records. Yet it is not what could have taken place, but what took place, or the historical record that is the proper goal for inquest. In the absence of direct indications, we may only deal with the problem of the Earth as a satellite of Saturn as a hypothetical construction, requiring further elucidation. It is assumed by modern astronomy that the ninth planet, Pluto, was once a satellite of Neptune, which, having collided with Triton, another satellite of the planet, was thrown out of the ring and became an independent planet. The satellite Triton, however, as a consequence of the collision, reversed the direction of its revolution and became a retrograde satellite. Another instance of a postulated conversion of a planetary satellite into an independent planet is discussed by Van Flandern and Harrington in their paper A Dynamical Investigation of the Conjecture that Mercury is an Escaped Satellite of Venus. Thus, the principle of a conversion of a satellite into a planet in its own right is not a phenomenon that is discussed here for the first time. The golden age of Saturn, or Kronos, came to its end when the supreme god of that period, the planet Saturn, was broken up. The age of Kronos was not the earliest age of which man retained some, however, dim memories, but farther into the past, the dimness amounts almost to darkness.
recently that the merits of the scientific issue do not alter the deplorable treatment Dr. Velikovsky's ideas received from the profession. The prejudging scorn and closing of ranks against the heretic showed typical guild animus. In recent years, however, evidence collected during the geophysical year and by several space probes has tended to verify several of Velikovsky's predictions. For instance, he had said in the face of strong disagreement that because of her recent birth, Venus is extremely hot, a view subsequently borne out by observations of Mariner 2. He was accused of inventing an interplanetary magnetic field, but one has been detected since then by Pioneer 5. He claimed in 1950 that the ancient civilizations of Central America were much older than Bleed. Recently, this view, too, has been proved by radiocarbon dating. All in all, a score of Dr. Velikovsky's predictions have been verified, and the opposition within the scientific community has abated. New voices are being heard. For instance, that of Lloyd Motz, professor of astronomy at Columbia University, who, while he still disagrees with Velikovsky, says his predictions should be recognized and his writings should be carefully studied and analyzed because they are the product of an extraordinary and brilliant mind and are based on some of the most concentrated and penetrating scholarship and research of our period. Here with us today on Camera 3 to discuss his theories with Dr. Velikovsky in his first television appearance is Eric Larrabee, editor and writer whose articles about Dr. Velikovsky were the earliest attempts to make him familiar to a wider audience, and whose latest piece in Harper's Magazine has directed attention to a re-examination of the Velikovsky theories.
Dr. Velikovsky, it's almost 15 years now since you first published Worlds in Collision, and in the years since you've published 3 other books, Volume 1 of Ages in Chaos, Earth in Upheaval, Oedipus and Akhenaton. And during this period there has been the curious paradox that although the scientific academic community hasn't by any means accepted what you have to say, that fortune has smiled on you in many respects, in the sense that science itself, point by point, has gone somewhat more in your direction. And also recently that one observes the phenomenon of the younger generation in the colleges and universities being more receptive to new ideas than the older. I was reminded of a quote of Max Planck's, which you know as well, that new ideas in science don't actually become accepted. What happens is that the proponents of the older ideas die off and are replaced. When you look at some of the things that have happened, some of the ways in which science has come your way, so to speak, and this much larger interest, much greater willingness to talk about your ideas in the colleges, how do you feel looking back on it? Which of the developments jump out to you the most? I remember you were saying once that you had never dreamed, when you first were thinking what you should write about the planet Venus, that in your lifetime you would see something like the space probe Mariner, which successfully went within 20,000 miles of that faraway planet. I know that stands out to you as one of the events of this time. What in particular led you to be so concerned with what Mariner would find on Venus, with in particular the question of Venus's heat, if I may
well,
say
you
so?
know, Mr. Larrabee, that Venus is persona dramatis of my first book. In that book, I claim that there were terrestrial catastrophes caused by extraterrestrial agents in prehistoric and also historical times. And I tried to identify the agent. Well, Venus, the story of Venus as a protoplanet, occupies large part of the book. However, in the beginning of the book, for about 150 pages, I describe the events that were observed and left memory of them in so many historical and also folkloristic documents of all civilizations.
And records.
Yes, and records. Now, you understand well that I had no personal means to send a marine probe. And so my hope and my prayer was that I should still have the chance in my lifetime, not only myself, but my opponents, I wish them long life, that they should be also witnesses of that probe, which now 2 years ago, I believe it was August of 1962, was launched, and by December 14, I think it was 14,
passed by
the date point.
Well, if I may be a devil's advocate just momentarily, I know what many of your critics have said is that a prediction like this is a matter of chance, and that they imply that you are pulling things out of the air. Well, obviously, you could have said a great many other things about Venus. You could have said Venus has 2 moons, or is made out of cottage cheese, or something other than saying that it is hot. What led you in particular to say, quite contrary to the belief of the time, that Venus was a hot planet?
Well, first I will say what I said. At the end of my book, in the very last 2 sections before the section, the end, I put 2 claims. So the position which I selected for them in my book by itself proves the importance I gave to them. These were, first, Venus must be very hot.
Must be hot.
Must be very hot, is very hot. I called the chapter Thermal Balance of Venus. And I said, Venus gives off heat. Not as usually supposed to be, a planet gets so much heat from the sun and reflects so much heat in the space. It gives its own heat. Of course, if it is a body like other bodies in the solar system of 6 billion years or longer, older, of course, then you would not expect that it would give give off heat. Now I said also that it was observed by contemporaries of those events and after as an incandescent body. At the same time, still in 1959, it was calculated and accepted that the surface temperature of Venus is 17 degrees Celsius, only about 3 degrees above the temperature of the Earth.
It's very similar to ours.
To Earth. Now, even so-called ashen light, which is shimmering off some light from the shadowed side of Venus, Venus between the Earth and the Sun has, like moon, a shadowed side, was explained by a cover of ice. Well, of course, you understand that there could be no ice as a temperature
which
lead is molten.
Yes.
Before Mariner, already in 1961, it was found that by radio signals arriving from Venus that it is very hot, actually 600 Fahrenheit.
And your reason for believing this was that your theory required that it be a new planet, a young planet in geological astronomical time.
Yes, it was the cause of the natal heat, but also the result of the short but very stormy history of this body.
Which is what you described in your book.
Which I described, actually not theorized as much as tried to reconstruct from ancient sources from so many civilizations.
Well, the reason that the objection that the scientific community has lavished on you, I assume, is that it is quite basic to a number of different sciences, that the life of the solar system has been uneventful, regular, in the terms in which we exactly as we see it now, for many, many hundreds of thousands of years.
Well, until very recently, this was the accepted view that the solar system is almost in a static state for, well, it was, when I started my book, it was said 2 billion. By now it is already 9 billion years. But recently, you know, it has become, it all changed. So many things were discovered, and one of them is the heat of Venus. And let me also say that 600 degree of 1959 was one of the reasons to send the Mariner probe to find that it is not so. I remember in December of that were year 62, when the Mariner probe was still on, just past the date point, but there was not yet the final report. I heard a man, scientist from Jet Propulsion Lab, who, speaking before the AAA convention in Philadelphia, made rather expressed his hope that it will be found the temperature much lower. What was found, it was still higher, not 600 but 800 degrees.
Well, there was another finding of Mariner which has just in this past week been still further confirmed, which is the question of Venus's motion. The recent confirmation of the retrograde motion is even more puzzling, is it not, and even more embarrassing to the.
It found first.
You were more comfortable. Yes. I see it's not embarrassing to your point of view.
No, not at all. Not
you were more comfortable with it.
Not at all. I would say that the Mariner probe surpassed all my wildest dreams. It found first, I would say, confirmed the find made before that by Pioneer 5, that the space, interplanetary space, is magnetic. Well, I was a target of much ridicule exactly because of this, that I invented forces that do not exist in the solar system, because I needed them to explain all these unusual events that took place in the sky, events that the Greek called theomachy, the battle of the gods.
I remember you saying one time that one description of your work might be to replace René Descartes back in the position he deserves in 17th century science. I believe you meant by this his theory of the tourbillon and the vortices as opposed to a Newtonian universe.
Yes, at least to put him back into position of a rightful contender of Newtonian theory, because very recently, actually a year before my book was published, in a book of philosopher Butterfield, I saw the sentence, in that great debate or contest, Descartes was the loser, because these worlds, these vortices that he described, these particles of matter or of ether that fill the universe, they are not there. Nobody found them, nobody discovered them. So it was an empty universe in which the celestial bodies in complete peace and eventfully travel for eons.
And the universe we see now is not that kind of place.
Not at all. But then again, Mariner found not only this, it found, of course, this heat. And there is no explanation for this heat. It would be after it was already found, there would be some explanation for it. The best it was done by Kuiper on assumptions that there is water vapors and carbon dioxide when it was thought 600. The best he could do with on this optimal condition for greenhouse effect would be 170 Fahrenheit. But now for 800 degrees, there is no explanation at all. Actually, I have to ask you whether you know any astronomer who has offered any theory that was acceptable to the next astronomer.
I think part of their reaction, again, if I may be the devil's advocate, is that the astronomers, although they may not have explanations for the puzzles that you forcefully put to their attention, the astronomers object, at least many of them objected at the time, because they thought evidence was being brought to their field from, to their minds, extraneous fields such as history, archaeology, and the like. they have not been willing, at least in recent time, to accept that sort of evidence as binding on questions of astronomy. I wonder sometimes when you think that your first book was the one largely given over to this question of the human record, what men said happened, and this involved a use of the past human material in an unusual, surprising way. Evidence first. If you had talked first about geology, if you had published Earth in Upheaval, which has a completely different kind of evidence in it, do you think they would have been more receptive?
I would not know. Many people affirm this, that would have I started with geological and paleontological evidence, I would have probably not met the same stormy opposition. But, and I understand, of course, that for astronomer to change his basic views on what he believes are mythology, but change his basic views on what he believes are mythology, old wives' tales, yes. Biblical story. You know, the Bible is a book that we are asked to swear on it, but we are asked also not to believe into it. And at least, well, you know, of course, that I am not a fundamentalist and didn't try in any way to prove the Bible right. But on the other hand, it happened to me to go even further than fundamentalists go, because when the Bible, and actually in so many places, in Psalms, in prophets, in Mosaic books, spoken about mountains that melt like wax, that the sea erupt, and other things, that the fundamentalists would believe that these are metaphors. But I found that the same sentence, the same description are plentifully available in Mexican, in Chinese, in
yes,
Hindu,
exactly,
in all
exactly.
that. And I didn't give any preference to the Bible.
Exactly.
Again,
I think this may have been one of the elements that confused the argument these 14, 15 years ago. The fact that it sounded like a fundamentalist argument, the fact that they didn't notice that you were drawing also on evidence from peoples all over the earth, from the ancient legends and records of all peoples, and the fact also that
you could not have been not noticed by those who read the book.
Well, I sometimes wonder, and I'm not. When you see some of the things that have been said about the book, you are sometimes led to doubt that they should have been
some
read
of
more
my
carefully.
objectors who thought that they can gain by this the sympathy of religious people accuse me that I gave the same valence to biblical description as to some mythology or some legend, folklore of primitive peoples or peoples in pagan religion.
Well, there is another point involved here, which is that when the argument over catastrophism went on in the 19th century, there were still many people who took a catastrophist or semi-catastrophist kind of view, who did so to have always put it in the other context.
Well, don't forget also that by now it's 100 years since Darwin achieved his victory over the book of Genesis. Now it is a little bit difficult to go back and to say, well, the story is not exactly so. We have the phenomena from all places, from the bottom of the sea with ash and with nickel, which is of meteoric origin, and the ash that covers all the bottom of the ocean. And you know, geologists today claim, like Professor Ewing of Columbia University, that it was an encounter with a terrific comet that spread this ash all over the world, and now it's found evenly spread on the bottom of the oceans. And you have now the accepted view, which was not accepted only 10 or 5 years ago, that the terrestrial axis moved, and that paleomagnetism proves us that terrestrial axis, that magnetic axis, and possibly like Runcorn and other of Manchester, claim that the Earth turned over. We know now from observation of Professor Danjon, director of Paris Observatory, that that flares on the sun may influence the speed of rotation of the Earth, and there were sudden changes. Only very recently we read even that Jupiter was subjected to strong changes, and this also confirmed one of the latest of my
point you had made.
Yes.
Isn't it strikingly true that the scientists who are willing to talk about these disturbances, about a change in the terrestrial axis, a change in the magnetic field of the Earth, that they are willing to talk about them provided they are put very far back in history? They are willing to talk about distortion of the Earth's crust, provided
well, this is a
far
psychological
back.
problem. You see, we generally don't like to know that we are traveling on a accident-prone planet. You of course understand that I am not a prophet of doom, just the other way around. I believe that we are now, if the man himself will not be the cause of his destruction, we are now in a settled solar system for eons to come. But in the past, there were, in human memory, these very events that by reconstruction of which I could put all those claims, what you call predictions, that now, like Professor Barham, Professor Morse, and others writing to Science and others claim for me these predictions, an unusual prediction, because it was not things that could be accepted, could be put into accepted scheme. Venus is hot. When it's calculated, only 17, and it's 100 degrees hot.
What?
Venus is covered by hydrocarbons. You know, 4 years before the publication of my book, I approached the director of Harvard College Observatory asking that spectral analysis should be performed on Venus. And he directed me to Professor Adams, director of Mount Wilson Observatory in California, in Palomar, and to Professor Wilt, still alive, at Yale. And I put before them this my request, explain that this is a crucial test. And understand, please, Venus is the last link in the theory. If there were catastrophes, and in historical times, and caused by extraterrestrial agent, and the agent was a protoplanet, Venus, and now I can say what Venus is like, that it is hot, that it is wrapped in a envelope of hydrocarbons. This I claimed
on the basis of the historical record.
Yes. And I asked this to be performed, and I got the answers. This was summer 46, 4 years before the publication of the book. There are no hydrocarbons on Venus, in writing. And I was so firm in my belief that I did not blunder in the interpretation of historical sources that I put in my book. There must be an envelope of hydrocarbons. And then when in February 63, 2 months after the Mariner passing its point, yes, then the report was given out, and it was hydrocarbons, dust and gases, exactly as I claimed it.
The embarrassment here for science is that you are seeking to unearth a natural fact by way of the humanistic evidence, which is to say you're bringing together a synthesis of different kinds of knowledge.
But let me
This
say
is
this.
an argument.
Let me ask you, what is the principle of uniformity? What does he say? Principle of uniformity on which is based the theory of evolution of Darwin. Our modern scientific thought is built on principle of uniformity, which crumbles by today. And what does it mean, this principle? Does it mean really that things that we do not observe today could not have happened years ago? What does it mean today? Today is this day in August?
But if you believe
it is not. If we don't see today a comet, do not exist comets. If we do not see since decades with an added eye that any nova, there are no novas.
That's exactly.
So where should
Camera 3 has appeared today at the endless fascination.
To the situation for the Earth when it was orbiting proto-Saturn, presumably. So we get to Proto-Saturn's capture. Capture by the sun is almost impossible gravitationally because there is no energy loss. There's no way of losing energy. A body coming in and swinging around the sun will depart again because there's nothing to put the brakes on and make it go around the sun. Electrical capture has a huge cross-section by comparison. Two stars will see each other electrically once their heliospheres, or astrospheres as they're called generically, touch. Now the sun's heliosphere is 100 astronomical units in radius. Another star would be something comparable. So you're talking about a huge cross-section. So the chances of capture of an object is far greater than gravity would suggest. Actually, I'll explain more about this when I give my presentation on cosmology, this change in gravity and so on. So Proto-Saturn changed from being a star, that is an anode in interstellar space, to becoming a cathode or cometary body in the sun's heliosphere. And like all cathodes, surface material is electrically ejected and the body may fragment under internal electrical stress. And this is the kind of thing which the ancients reported. As you may expect in the electrical model, a brown dwarf desert has been identified close to bright main sequence stars because the brown dwarf switches off and becomes a gas giant. And this is what is seen by astronomers. You won't find brown dwarfs orbiting closely to bright stars. So gravitational theory only accommodates accretion disks. Expulsion disks are believed impossible despite the copious evidence of stars ejecting matter in jets. Even the sun does it in a modest coronal mass ejection kind of way. It's also interesting to note the large number of close orbiting gas giants about nearby stars. This fits the electrical fissioning argument and not the nebular accretion model. Gas giants have also been discovered at distances from their stars where they couldn't have formed within the age of the star. All of the impossible planets and stars being discovered are not impossible in the electric universe model. Instead, they are expected based on that model. I'll deal with this issue in my presentation on cosmology. So it explains why there are so many hot Jupiters that have been found closely orbiting a star. It explains the expulsion rings and many satellites of the gas giant planets in our solar system, and the fact that Saturns are the most spectacular indicates that it was the last or most recent gas giant to flare up and eject matter. Right. Axial tilt families. A simple method of identifying related objects in the solar system is to look at their axial tilts, because in the close relationship between a gas giant or a brown dwarf and its close orbiting satellites, there will generally be phase lock. The satellites all have the same face pointing towards the parent. And as these close orbiting satellites therefore will have their rotation axis aligned with the parent. Having the same degree of axial tilt, modified by precession after disturbance, like the tearing apart of the Saturnian system, that tilt to the plane of their orbits of the ecliptic should be roughly the same. And this is one way of trying to identify members of the same family, because the Sun has an adopted family. So when you look at the planets here, you've got Mars, and you've got Venus, and you've got Earth, and you've got Saturn, the main players. But Venus is the odd one out, because research shows with great certainty that it was born from Proto-Saturn in a massive flare-up resulting from the initial adjustment to the present Sun's quite different electrical environment. And this is why there are all those radiating streamers, because it was born as a comet from an already cometary body. So the cometary body fissioned, and the the resulting ejected body went into, it was still captured by its parent, but it too was busily discharging frantically, trying to adjust to its electrical environment. So all of the radiating streamers and the colossal Venus comet appearances can be explained by this model. Now, when Venus was ejecting material, it occurred equatorial. We were sitting underneath this chain of objects, and the streamers were coming out radiating from Venus. And this is actually what we see on Venus today. The scars are wrapped around the equator. But also, when these bodies are ejected, the main body may be spinning this way, and the material is ejected in a stream. It's given a backward kick by its parent. And the result is that the satellite initially, at least, has a backward rotation, and this is what Venus has, very slow backward rotation.
Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. The parent star of planet Earth holds a strange and special place in countless ancient traditions around the world. The celestial body identified as the sun in myth, religion, ancient astronomies, and rock art routinely bears no resemblance at all to our familiar sun. One of the most common ancient depictions of the sun is an orb or star within a crescent, an image with no modern natural referent. And numerous traditions depict the sun as a spectacular celestial wheel, with a warrior hero appearing as the axle of the wheel. For decades, comparative mythologist Ev Cochrane, as well as his colleague David Talbot, have worked to reconstruct the natural events that produce these extraordinary mythical patterns. It is their conclusion that in the relatively recent past, in the era of prehistory, a period of instability reigned in the inner solar system, bringing planets within close proximity to Earth. In this episode, Ev begins our investigation into the question, did ancient man observe a different sun?
It is important to underscore the radical nature of our hypothesis. We hold that the solar system has only recently been subject to wholesale reordering, that in fact, well within the memory of mankind, a different sun prevailed. Our hypothesis is fundamentally a work of historical reconstruction based upon our mutual researches in comparative mythology and ancient religion. The research of Dave and myself is distinguished from other comparative mythologists in that we draw upon and emphasize the message of prehistoric rock art to illustrate our findings from literary traditions. To take but one example from hundreds that might be offered, ancient paintings and petroglyphs of the sun depict a wheel-like object, commonly 4- or 8-spoked in structure. Such artworks are global in nature. Yet how is this fact to be explained? From the conventional standpoint, such artworks are interpreted as abstract or metaphorical in nature. Miranda Green, for example, in her otherwise interesting book, The Sun Gods of Ancient Europe, concludes, "The pictures do not describe reality." We beg to differ. It is our view that the prehistoric paintings accurately reflect the appearance of the ancient sky and offer compelling testimony with regards to an unfolding catastrophic celestial event in which nearby planets dominated the northern circumpolar heavens. The mere fact that analogous sun petroglyphs will be found around the globe supports this conclusion. At the same time, ancient myth offers corroborating testimony in this regard, wherein a different sun dominated the sky in former times and presented a wheel-like appearance. In this sense, as in countless other examples, the testimony of ancient myth and prehistoric rock art agrees at a level of detail that is impossible to explain by mere coincidence. In the Thunderbolts of the Gods, together with a number of other recent publications, Dave and myself have presented a wealth of evidence that the former sun was the focus of prodigious electrical activity and the source of spectacular outbursts of lightning, heaven-spanning storms, and aurora-like phenomenon. In ancient Mesopotamia, for example, the Sumerian word for sun is Ud. The same word is employed to write storm or thunder god, a startling extension of meaning. Sumerian hymns invoking the ancient sun god likewise describe it as a source of storms. So one hymn reads, "The sun god thunders over the mountains like a storm." Another hymn reads, "As my king, the sun god, comes forth, the heavens tremble before him and the earth shakes before him." Now I ask, does this sound like a realistic description of the modern experience of sunrise? In what sense is the sun's appearance over the eastern horizon ever accompanied by a shaking of heaven and earth or great bouts of lightning? What could the sun have to do with thunder and lightning? In the present solar system, of course, the answer is nothing at all. Yet the mere fact that other ancient languages preserve this very same semantic link between sun and lightning confirms the fundamental historical veracity of the Sumerian traditions and cries out for an explanation. Ancient Egypt, for example, offers corroborating testimony in this regard. In the pyramid text from the 3rd millennium BCE, the sun god's thunderbolt is specifically compared to the lightnings of the sun. The word in question here is mut, M-A-W-T, which has cognates denoting lightning in numerous other African languages. Significantly, however, the very same word is used to denote the spokes of a wheel. In the present world, of course, lightning has nothing whatsoever to do with the sun or wheels, hence the fundamental importance of such terminology for our historical reconstruction. But we need not rely simply on ancient language and myth alone. Mesopotamian cylinder seals, together with prehistoric rock art and other early artworks, likewise depict the sun with lightning-like structures emanating from its core. Students of comparative myth will recognize the structure adorning the face of the sun here as the thunderbolt wielded by the thunder god. So, for example, thunder gods like Zeus or the Semitic Adad are routinely depicted holding exactly this thunderbolt. Properly understood, the evidence from ancient language, like the testimony of prehistoric rock art, represents an enduring fossilized record of a different solar system, much as the discovery of a dinosaur bone harks back to its former age, one radically different from that which currently prevails. It must be remembered here that the denigration of myth is a relatively recent development, basically originating during the early decades of the 20th century. The science of comparative mythology, like the complementary science of comparative linguistics, grew out of the 19th century writings of world-class scholars such as Max Muller and Adalbert Kuhn, who rightly emphasized the prominent role of the sun and the thunder god in ancient myth and religion. Yet the excesses of these schools, together with that of the Pan-Babylonians, led to a general backlash against naturist or astronomical interpretations of myth and religion. Current models of myth, such as that advanced by George Dumézil, which dominates scholarship, emphasize linguistic connections above all else and are much more narrow-minded in scope. For example, Dumézil largely focuses on Indo-European myth. Most important, perhaps, is the fact that current models of myth always seek to understand the ancient traditions by reference to the present sky. But the ancient testimony is impossible to square with the present solar system. And as a result, scholars are left with empty slogans pointing to figurative language, metaphor, and such statements as that of Green, quoted earlier, to the effect that the pictures do not describe reality. As Dave and I have documented, however, granted the fact that the ancient traditions and prehistoric rock art complement each other, it therefore stands to reason that they do indeed describe historical reality. Confronted by these sun wheels, for example, on ancient rock art, the default position of so many modern scholars is just to ascribe those artworks to imagination or abstract forms, completely overlooking the fact that the same exact design is found all over the world. So at that point, you need to ask yourself a question. Were ancient sky watchers on every continent on the earth imagining the same fantastic structure in the sky? which in this case is just a cross on the face of the sun or a lightning bolt on the face of the sun. But we could cite 1,000 other structures that we could describe if we wanted to. We're just trying to focus the discussion on these particular structures at the moment. But are we supposed to imagine that all these skywatchers all around the globe were imagining the same thing? That is not a logically sound position. It's much more rational to assume that the ancient skywatchers were trying to describe their personal reality. They drew the picture of the sun that they saw, and that's why those pictures agree all around the world. Things that are imagined are not going to agree unanimously around the world. It's just that simple.